Hey everybody, and welcome back to part 4 of my series on making a magic card template in Photoshop. In this video I'm going to be making a custom mana cost system. I don't generally like to use the default mana symbols. I like to make my own system that's somehow unique and more compact and looks different. So the concept for the mana cost in this specific template is that I want to make sure that I can have the title fit at the top being centered. And what that means is that if the title is going to be really long and the mana cost also needs to be long, there's not space for both of them to fit up there, which is why usually the title is justified on the left. It's all the way over to the left and the mana is all the way to the right. But having the title centered means that it can get in the way of the mana cost. So the concept for this one is that the mana cost is going to be aligned vertically instead of horizontally. So this way it's always a fixed width and it's never going to collide with the title. My first idea for this vertical mana cost system was to have all of the mana symbols connected in one big long pill shape. So the mana symbols in the center would be in square boxes, and then the ones on the ends would have rounded edges. So to do that I have to make two shapes. One is just the square for the ones in the middle, and then I have to make the square with the rounded edges for the end caps. So you see me making those shapes here. Next I add a bit of texture with the simple blending mode, and then I start pasting the shapes together to see what they look like all linked up. I change the colors of the symbols using clipping masks in the same method that I showed you in the last video, and then here I'm changing the texture a little bit because I thought the last one was a little too contrasty. Then I start messing with layer styles, adding a bit of a stroke, and then playing with a thicker outer stroke, changing the size of it, messing with bevel and emboss. There's really no plan here. I'm just messing with stuff until I get an idea that I think is going to look good. At this point I decide that the pill idea kind of sucks, and so I started messing with other shapes to try to figure out a different concept that's going to look better. So I try this rounded idea where it plays more off of the original circular shape of mana symbols, but they're still connected vertically in the same way. It's just the symbols nest into each other with these semicircle lines instead of the straight lines that the last concept had, which ended up looking not really like a mana symbol should. So here I'm messing with the layer styles to look a bit better. I actually put the lower symbol on a layer underneath the upper symbol so that it can kind of like hide that sharper edge above, because sometimes when you're using the bevel and emboss layer styles, it makes weird looking edges, so I just hide that underneath the upper mana symbol. At this point I'm ready to start testing what it looks like with an actual mana cost in, so I put in the text for the generic mana, and I put a little bit of an outer bevel on that, and then I put a thin stroke over the upper mana symbol, just because it looks nicer than having the two soft bevels clashing right next to each other. I tune the color of the green a little bit, and then I go in and add the green mana symbol. Since we're using a pixel-based system and the mana symbols end up so small, when I'm importing a symbol like this, I can really afford to be very rough with it. I literally just use a magic wand tool and then cut it and shrink it down to size and put it in there. If it were vectors, it would be different, but it's so small and it gets reduced to so little pixels anyway that any flaws are not going to be recognizable. So I use hue and saturation adjustment to drop it all the way to make sure it's 100% black, and then I shrink it down to size. I then add the bevel and emboss effect to the green mana symbol as well, and then I go in and duplicate it because Vengefine is too green, just to visualize what the actual mana symbol is going to look like. Similar to how we added the color identity line around the title bar in the last episode, I want that same thing to go around the mana symbols in this one. So I just duplicate the whole chunk and then make a selection, expand it, and then that's my shape. And I just drag that into my clipping mask folder from last episode, and now it's matching the color identity. That color indicator border layer does need to be longer if the mana cost is longer and shorter if the mana cost is shorter, but it's a very simple solution. You just make a couple of them, put them in a folder, and then put that inside the clipping mask folder, and it's fully modulatable and it'll work with whatever mana cost you throw at it. I then go in and add all of the mana symbols so that it's fully functional with whatever card. And up to this point, I had been keeping the actual black symbols on a different layer from the color behind it, just so I can go back and tune the color a little bit later. And also so I can change the bevel and emboss layer effect without having everything merged. But after this, I just go ahead and merge them, just so there's not two layers to flip on and off every time you want to change the color of the mana symbol. So at this point, I've got a folder with all of the symbols clipping down to the two possible shapes that it could be, the end cap at the top that's just a circle, and then the bottom shape where it nests below. So I can swap it to whatever color it needs to be in whatever position it needs to be. So at this point, now that I have the whole folder set up, I can go ahead and make 4 or 5 copies of them, so I have a long chain, and I can make basically whatever mana cost. And I know somebody's probably going to comment about the Progenitus Test, which is basically putting the longest mana symbol and seeing if it fits. And here in this template, I've only allowed for 5 symbols in the mana cost. And the reason I didn't do anything longer is because when I have these folders where there's like 6 or 7 layers being clipped to 2 possible shapes, it does just take up some space. And so if I duplicate those folders, and there's layer effects applying to all those too, which can make things laggy sometimes. So if you duplicate that 10 times to allow for Progenitus, and then you're loading that up every time you need to make a new card, you're loading all those layers with all those layer effects for no good reason. So I actually have done a Progenitus in this frame with the vertical mana cost, and literally all you have to do is just duplicate the 5 over again so that you have 10, and it works. So I wouldn't recommend keeping a bunch of unnecessary layers around, making your files giant, making save times really long, just for the sake of having compatibility with like fringe cases. Like in those cases, you can just modify your template and it'll be fine. So at this point, I'm making a variation of this mana system where it's horizontal, just to fit into the text box for in-text mana or activated abilities, that kind of stuff. And basically all I had to do to make this was I kept around the folder of the mana symbol before I merged the symbols to the color layers. And so I can actually, using that pre-merged version, I can literally just turn the shape that everything is getting clipped to, but not turn the symbols themselves. And so basically the symbols are staying where they are, but the clipping mask is getting rotated. And so now I can just duplicate that and line it up to the left, and now it's horizontal. Then I go in and add the colorless mana symbol, and this is more important to have in the in-text mana than it is in the casting cost, because in the casting cost it only comes up for like Eldrazi, but in the in-text mana that's horizontal it comes up a lot, like if you're making a soul ring or something that taps for colorless mana. So at this point I have all the mana stuff I'm going to need, and so I go and put it in the text box and size it to make sure it's sized correctly, and then I duplicate one of them and make a tap symbol. And so if you have a card that has multiple tap symbols or multiple activated abilities, you can just duplicate this stuff, but I wouldn't keep it around in your template because, again, like the Progenitus thing, it makes your file unnecessarily big for something that you're not going to use that often. So that's pretty much everything for the custom mana symbols. In the next part of the series, I'm going to be adding some finishing touches, more details, text box, that kind of stuff. And again, announcement videos going up soon about my new game that I'm making from scratch, and there will be more videos about that soon. 2 more parts to this series, and then the announcement videos going up and the channel's rebranding. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.